Sometime in the 1950s, Marilyn Monroe walked back into the building where she'd once lived as a child. By then, her face had been on magazine covers in countries she'd never visited. Her name appeared above movie theaters. Photographers competed for her attention. Crowds recognized her before she reached a doorway. But inside this old children's home was something much quieter than fame. A guest book, page after page of visitors leaving their names behind. And according to Holly Grove's longtime director, when Marilyn signed that book on her first return visit, she didn't write the name the world knew. She wrote Norma Jeane Baker. We'll come back to that signature. By the end of this story, those 3 words are going to mean something very different from what they mean right now. But first, we have to go back to a time before either name carried any weight at all. When a little girl in Los Angeles didn't get to choose her own last name, and didn't get to choose where she lived, either. Norma Jeane entered the world in Los Angeles on June 1, 1926. She was born Norma Jeane Mortenson. She was later baptized Norma Jeane Baker, using her mother's family name. 2 surnames before she was old enough to understand why names mattered. Her father wasn't part of her upbringing. Her mother, Gladys, struggled with serious mental illness. And for much of Norma Jeane's childhood, the basic question of where she would sleep and who would take care of her was answered by other adults. Foster families, family friends, institutional staff, not by the person she belonged to. For the first several years of her life, Norma Jeane moved through foster arrangements. There was a period when she lived with Gladys directly, but it didn't last. Gladys's psychiatric condition worsened, and she was eventually institutionalized. A family friend named Grace Goddard became one of the adults responsible for Norma Jeane's care. And this is where Marilyn's childhood becomes easy to tell badly. You can turn it into a parade of misery. One terrible home after another. One villain after another. A straight line from suffering to stardom. It makes a clean story. It also isn't true. Some adults genuinely cared for her. Some arrangements lasted longer than others. There were periods she later remembered more warmly. There were people who tried. And underneath all of that was one fact that kept returning no matter which adult stepped in. Norma Jeane didn't control where she went next. Then, in September 1935, when she was 9 years old, she was taken to a place called the Los Angeles Orphans Home Society. She would remain connected to the institution until the summer of 1937. And here's the first contradiction most people never think about. The building said, Orphans Home. Norma Jeane wasn't technically an orphan. Her mother was alive. Decades later, Holly Grove's own leadership would make exactly that distinction. Many of the children who lived there had living parents. Those parents simply couldn't care for them. The institution eventually moved away from the word orphan in its name entirely. That changes the emotional picture more than it might seem. If you're told a child has no parents, your mind imagines one kind of loss. But what if the child knows her mother exists somewhere? What if she knows there is a person connected to her story, someone who belongs to her history, but who still can't take her home? There isn't a clean ending to that feeling. And we shouldn't build one for Norma Jeane just because it would make the story easier to hear. 9 years old, a girl's residence, rules, other children, adults running daily life, and beyond the grounds, Hollywood. The Los Angeles Times later reported that the girl's residence had a sightline toward Paramount Studios and its familiar water tower. It's tempting to write a perfect scene here. Little Norma Jeane staring through a window at Paramount, promising herself that one day she'd be a star. But we don't know that happened, so we won't pretend it did. The real image is already strong enough. A child living inside an institution, within walking distance of the physical machinery that would one day turn her into Marilyn Monroe. She couldn't know that yet. At 9, Marilyn Monroe didn't exist. There was only Norma Jeane, and something was happening to her during those years that would follow her much farther than anyone would later guess. In a 1960 interview, Marilyn recalled that she first started stuttering while she was living at the Los Angeles Orphans Home. Hold on to that, because one day, millions of people would recognize Marilyn Monroe by the sound of her voice. Soft, breathy, carefully shaped, instantly identifiable. Comedians imitated it. Audiences around the world associated it with the most glamorous woman in Hollywood. But before any of that, There was a 9-year-old girl sometimes struggling to get her words out. And that difficulty didn't stay at the orphanage. It followed her. Marilyn said the stutter returned during her early teenage years. She described being elected secretary of a school club and having to read meeting minutes aloud, and struggling through it. That's a tiny detail. It wouldn't fit on a movie poster. But it's exactly the kind of detail that brings Norma Jeane into focus as a real person instead of a prologue to someone else's fame. Long before anyone copied Marilyn Monroe's manner of speaking, there was a girl who could be anxious about getting through a sentence in front of her classmates, and the stutter's story isn't finished. It will come back one more time before this is over, in a moment nobody expected. But first, another problem arrived. One that would change Norma Jeane's life in ways she couldn't have predicted. You've probably heard Marilyn Monroe described as an orphan who escaped into Hollywood. The poor girl who became the glamorous star. It's almost perfect storytelling. Nobody becomes somebody, the curtain rises, the past disappears. Except it didn't happen that way. Norma Jeane's childhood wasn't one orphanage followed by one miraculous rescue. There were foster arrangements, time with her mother's hospitalization, Grace Goddard and other adults assuming responsibility. The orphanage. More changes afterward. The actual story is messier because there isn't one person we can blame for everything. Gladys wasn't a mother who decided she didn't want her daughter. She was seriously ill. Grace wasn't a fairy tale rescuer who permanently fixed everything. She was a family friend managing circumstances that kept shifting. And even the orphanage wasn't the dark caricature later retellings sometimes made it. Hollygrove's director Judith Nelson eventually pushed back against books that had repeated exaggerated stories about Marilyn's time there. One claim, for example, had Norma Jeane cleaning an impossible number of toilets the institution never even had. That's worth stating clearly. We don't need invented suffering to make this story hurt. A 9-year-old girl was living away from her mother because her mother couldn't care for her. That fact, documented and real, is enough. And while she was growing up, something else began offering Norma Jeane a place where the world held still for a while: movies. In a 1951 interview, she remembered becoming deeply fascinated by films. She said that by junior high, when she liked a picture, she'd sometimes see it repeatedly if she could afford to. Think about that carefully. Years later, people would pay to escape into her movies. But before anyone paid to see Marilyn Monroe, Norma Jeane was the one sitting in the dark, escaping into somebody else's. It wasn't necessarily a grand career plan. A child can love movies without secretly plotting to conquer Hollywood. What matters is that film gave her something her daily life often didn't. A story with a beginning, a middle, and an ending. Characters who belonged somewhere. A world that stayed the same for the length of the picture. Meanwhile, outside the theater, her own circumstances were still shifting. By the time Norma Jeane reached her mid-teens, Grace Goddard's household situation had changed. Norma Jeane faced the possibility of being moved again. She was no longer 9. She was 15 going on 16. Old enough to understand what another placement meant. Still too young to have many choices about it. One possible solution came from the family next door, James Doherty. Doherty later said, Grace and her husband were preparing to move and couldn't take Norma Jeane with them. According to his recollection, another foster placement or a return to institutional care was a real possibility. So marriage was suggested. Norma Jeane was 15 when Doherty began dating her. He was 20. They married on June 19, 1942. She had turned 16 only 18 days earlier. Some versions of this story say she married him purely to escape the foster system. Others frame it as a simple teenage romance. Doherty himself remembered both realities existing at the same time. He said the marriage prevented another placement, and he insisted they cared about each other. That makes more human sense than either version alone. People don't always make major life decisions for a single reason. A 16-year-old could genuinely care about a young man, and also know that marrying him meant she wouldn't be sent somewhere else again. And with that wedding, Norma Jeane's name changed once more. Norma Jeane Baker became Norma Jeane Doherty. Another surname, another house. Another attempt at permanence. She was still years away from the name the world would learn. If you're watching this and you've started to see Norma Jeane differently, not as a footnote to Marilyn Monroe, but as a person who existed before any of this, subscribe to this channel, because every story we tell here is built on the same principle: the human being came first, the legend came second. For a time, Norma Jeane and James Dougherty lived like an ordinary young wartime couple. They had an apartment, then other homes. Dougherty eventually joined the Merchant Marine. Norma Jeane worked. And one of those jobs changed everything. She was placed at the Radio Plane Company in Southern California, where remote-controlled target aircraft were being produced for military use. It was factory work. Practical, unglamorous, the kind of job that doesn't appear in anyone's fantasy of how a movie star gets discovered. But in 1945, a photographer named David Conover arrived at the plant. He was there to photograph women contributing to the war effort. He noticed Norma Jeane. Those photographs didn't make her famous overnight. The later version of the story can make it look like destiny. Camera finds beautiful girl becomes movie star, credits roll. From Norma Jeane's actual position, what was happening was quieter and far more important. For the first time in her life, she was discovering a skill that gave her choices. She photographed well. She learned quickly how to work with a camera. She began to understand what the lens responded to. Modeling work followed. She joined an agency. More assignments came. The girl whose childhood had been organized almost entirely by adults around her, foster parents, guardians, institutions, a husband, was beginning to make professional decisions of her own. That doesn't mean every decision was free. Money mattered. Marriage mattered. Industry expectations mattered enormously. But something had entered her life that hadn't been there before: agency. She was starting to shape what happened next, instead of waiting for someone else to decide it. And the marriage began pulling in a different direction from the career. Dougherty later remembered that when he returned from overseas, Norma Jeane's ambition had changed the future they'd once imagined together. They divorced in 1946. Then came Fox. And with Fox came a moment that sounds small, until you remember the story we've been following. They wanted to change her name. Norma Jeane Dougherty didn't sound, to the studio, like the name of a new movie star. Casting executive Ben Lyon and Norma Jeane discussed alternatives. The account preserved by the Los Angeles Times says Lyon suggested Marilyn, after actress Marilyn Miller. For the surname, Norma Jeane reached into her mother's family history. Monroe. Pause on that. This wasn't childhood paperwork she had no say over. This wasn't a foster placement assigning her to a new household. This wasn't marriage giving her another man's last name. For the first time, Norma Jeane was participating in choosing what she would be called. Marilyn Monroe, a professional name, a Hollywood name, a name designed for marquees and camera flashes and the sides of buildings. But she didn't instantly stop being Norma Jeane in every legal sense. Years later, while testifying in court, she still identified Norma Jeane Dougherty as her legal name and explained that Marilyn Monroe was the professional name she'd taken when she entered studio work. The two names overlapped. The two histories overlapped. The woman continued, carrying both. And the name that had started as a professional invention began to grow into something much larger than a studio credit. By the early 1950s, Marilyn Monroe was no longer an unknown actress chasing small parts. Her photographs circulated everywhere. Films including Niagara, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and How to Marry a Millionaire turned the name into something bigger than any casting director had planned. It became an image, an idea, a presence that audiences recognized before she spoke a single line. And then, in 1956, Marilyn made the name permanent. A surviving court application documents her request to legally change her name to Marilyn Monroe. The name that began as a professional choice was no longer just printed on movie posters. It was legally hers. But while Marilyn Monroe was becoming permanent in the eyes of the world, the institution from her childhood was still standing. And the girl who once lived inside it hadn't forgotten where it was. Now let's go back to the stutter, because its final appearance is the one that matters most. By the time Marilyn Monroe became famous, her voice was part of the image. Soft, controlled, Immediately recognizable. People imitated it. Comedians exaggerated it. Audiences assumed it had always been there, that she'd always sounded like that, effortlessly. Which makes something she recalled in 1960 hit differently now. She said the stutter that had started at the orphanage, the one that had followed her into adolescence, could still return later in life. And she remembered one specific moment. An assistant director heard her stutter on set and reacted with disbelief. He'd never heard her do it before. Her response was almost playful. Essentially, "You only think I don't stutter. Sit with that for a second." The most famous voice in Hollywood, the one people associated with glamour, with confidence, with effortless screen presence, still carried inside it a vulnerability the audience didn't know existed. That doesn't make the voice fake. It makes it something she worked for, something she built. And Marilyn worked at far more than the world generally gave her credit for. The image looked effortless. The human being wasn't. So what do the orphanage years actually tell us, now that we've walked through them? They tell us that the word orphan is too simple. Norma Jeane's father wasn't part of her upbringing. Her mother was alive, but seriously ill and unable to provide consistent care. That left Norma Jeane dependent on foster families, family friends, and an institution. Not because nobody existed who was connected to her, but because the people who were couldn't give her what she needed. A child can miss a living parent. A child can hope things will change. A child can be connected to someone and still be separated from them. That's not the same as having nobody. In some ways, it's harder to explain, which is probably why so many retellings replaced it with the simpler word. They also tell us that Norma Jeane didn't come from nothing. She came from instability. People did care for her. The foster system provided places to stay. Grace Goddard took responsibility. Doherty entered her life. Some adults helped, some arrangements failed, some circumstances simply changed. Reducing all of those people to villains makes the story easier to narrate but less true. And they tell us, most importantly, that Norma Jeane didn't disappear when Marilyn Monroe appeared. We know that because the record itself refuses to cooperate with the myth. In 1952, while already known professionally as Marilyn Monroe, she told a court that her legal name was still Norma Jeane Doherty. In the 1950s, after fame had arrived, she returned to Hollygrove 3 times. On one visit, she signed the guest book as Norma Jeane Baker. On later visits, she signed as Marilyn Monroe. Then in 1956, she moved to make Marilyn Monroe her legal name. That's not one woman killing off another identity. It's one life moving through different names, each one attached to a different chapter, each one carrying its own weight. Now bring it all together. Norma Jeane Mortenson, Norma Jeane Baker, Norma Jeane Doherty, Marilyn Monroe, 4 surnames across one life. It can sound almost theatrical when you list them that way, but a name on paper does something very basic. It identifies you. It tells a school which record belongs to you. It tells an institution which file to open. It tells a clerk what to write on a form. What it can't do is promise that the life attached to it will stay stable. A surname can't guarantee that the adult connected to it will still be able to care for you next year. It can't keep a foster arrangement from ending. It can't cure your mother's illness. It can't prevent another move. And that's why one ordinary signature in an old guest book carries more weight than it has any right to. Picture the page without adding anything that isn't there. No dramatic music, no invented tears, no secret confession, just handwriting. A woman returning to an institution from her childhood. Famous now, very famous. The little girl who once lived in the Los Angeles Orphans Home has become someone whose photographs travel around the world. And she signs, Norma Jeane Baker. Later, on other visits, Marilyn Monroe. At the beginning of this story, those 2 names looked like a simple contrast, the unknown girl and the famous star. Now they mean something quieter. Norma Jeane Baker belonged to the years when other people were making the decisions about where she lived. Marilyn Monroe belonged to the years when she had begun making far more decisions herself. One name was tied to foster care, school, the orphanage, and adolescence. The other became tied to cameras, contracts, performances, and fame. But the guest book doesn't separate them. It keeps them in the same place, on the same pages, in the same building. Marilyn Monroe was something she worked to create. Norma Jeane was the history she brought into that creation. Both names belonged to her. Both lives belonged to her. And when she walked back into Hollygrove, she brought the famous woman into a building that had known the girl before fame existed. And the old name could still come naturally enough to be written down. And this is where we should leave Marilyn. Not at the end of her life, not in 1962, not inside the mystery people keep rebuilding around her death. Go back instead to Hollygrove in the 1950s. Marilyn Monroe is famous now. The child who once lived in the Los Angeles Orphans Home has become one of the most photographed women alive. And she comes back. 3 times, according to the institution's director. We don't need to invent a speech for her. We don't need to say she stood in a particular hallway and wept. We don't know that. The return itself says enough. Most people spend their lives moving away from childhood. Marilyn had moved farther than most. From foster care to an orphanage, to marriage at 16, to factory work, to modeling, to Hollywood, to one of the most recognizable names of the 20th century. And still, the road led back to that building. At the beginning, we asked which name was real. That was probably the wrong question. The better question is, what did each name have to carry? Because before the world had any idea who Marilyn Monroe was, Norma Jeane was already a person, not a prologue, not a tragedy waiting to happen, not an unfinished movie star, a little girl trying to find somewhere stable enough to call home, and Hollywood never invented her from nothing. It gave the world a new name for a woman who had already lived through more than the posters could ever show. If this story changed the way you see Marilyn, tell me in the comments. When you hear the name Marilyn Monroe now, do you still picture the movie star first? Or do you think about Norma Jeane differently after hearing what came before? And if you want more carefully researched stories that bring the person back into focus without turning her pain into gossip, like this video and subscribe. There are still letters, photographs, contracts, and small moments from Marilyn's life that deserve to be told properly. That's exactly what we'll keep doing here.